It was the kind of night that clung to memory, cold, quiet, and full of the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. March 16, 2002. The small farming town of Claridge, Nebraska, lay under a heavy sky, stars faint behind drifting clouds. A single gas station on the edge of town glowed like a beacon in the darkness, its neon sign flickering. Inside, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, until the bell above the door chimed. Rachel Whitaker, 24 years old, walked in with her usual easy smile. She was a local, born and raised in Claridge, a place where everyone knew everyone. She worked as a third-grade teacher at the elementary school and spent her weekends helping her dad run the family's feed store. People liked Rachel because she was kind, funny, and always the first to volunteer when someone needed help. That night, she was on her way home from her friend Emma's house, where they'd been planning decorations for the town's spring festival. She stopped to fill her car and grab a soda before heading back to her small apartment on the north side of town. The clerk, a young guy named Kevin Dorsey, remembered her clearly. She'd smiled, waved, and joked about how her car barely made it through the winter. She paid in cash, $4.12, and walked back out to her white Honda Civic. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rachel Whitaker alive. The next morning, her car was found parked on a gravel turnout about 4 miles north of town, engine off, keys still in the ignition. Her purse sat on the passenger seat. Her phone, a flip-style Nokia, was in the cup holder, but Rachel was gone. By noon, Claridge was swarming with deputies, volunteers, and news crews. The Whitaker family had lived there for generations. Rachel's father, Tom, was well known and respected. People showed up from miles around to help search the fields and wooded ditches that lined Highway 29. They walked shoulder to shoulder, calling her name into the empty wind. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no tire tracks except her own. Detective Alan Mercer, then 38, was assigned as lead investigator. He'd worked homicide cases before, but this one felt different, personal, intimate. There was no indication Rachel had planned to leave. No financial issues, no relationship troubles. She was steady, reliable, loved. Mercer and his team canvassed the town, interviewing everyone she knew. Friends described her as careful, someone who never gave rides to strangers, someone who always called her parents after late nights. Emma, her best friend, broke down crying during questioning, saying she was supposed to call me when she got home. She never didn't call. The search continued for weeks. Helicopters flew low over the plains. Dogs combed the frozen soil, and neighbors prayed in church halls. By early April, the sheriff's department expanded the search radius to nearby counties. Then, 3 weeks after her disappearance, a farmer named Dale Benson found something in a drainage culvert off County Road 42. It was Rachel's scarf, blue, knitted by her mother, tangled around a rusted pipe. 100 yards further down, deputies found more. A single shoe, a torn jacket sleeve, and then in a shallow ravine nearby, the remains. The town went silent that day. Rachel's body was recovered and transported to the State Forensic Lab in Lincoln. The coroner's report confirmed what Mercer already suspected: blunt force trauma to the head, along with bruising on her wrists and signs of a violent struggle. She had fought back. Investigators processed the scene meticulously. Soil samples, fibers, and fragments of DNA were collected and preserved. A small amount of unidentified blood was found on Rachel's jacket and under her fingernails. But in 2002, DNA testing was still limited. They could tell it wasn't hers, but not who it belonged to. Mercer held a press conference days later, his voice steady but grim. "We are treating this as a homicide," he said, "and we will not rest until we find who did this." The Whitakers buried their daughter in late April. Hundreds attended. The local church overflowed with flowers and photographs. Rachel laughing, Rachel teaching, Rachel with her dog Daisy. Her father spoke softly through tears. She was light, he said, and someone tried to put that light out. But they didn't, not really. Weeks turned to months, and months turned into years. Leads came and went. Tips dried up. The case slowly moved from Mercer's active board to the cold case shelf, filed away in a metal cabinet that smelled of dust and regret. Clayridge moved on, at least on the surface. But beneath the quiet routines and small-town smiles, the memory of Rachel Whitaker lingered like a ghost. People still mentioned her in whispers, at the diner, at the school, in the pews on Sunday mornings. Detective Mercer never stopped thinking about her. Even after transferring to another division, he'd sometimes pull out the old case file, photographs, witness statements, lab reports, all the same puzzle pieces that had gone nowhere. The one thing that always haunted him was the unknown DNA sample. It sat frozen in the state lab's evidence freezer for years, a fragment of truth waiting for a name. In 2018, technology finally caught up. The Nebraska State Crime Lab began reprocessing old samples using advanced STR analysis and genealogy matching. Mercer, now near retirement, submitted the Whitaker DNA again, almost out of hope more than belief. 6 months later, he got a call that would change everything. A partial match had been found in a national database, not a direct hit, but a familial one. Someone related to the killer had been entered into the system. It was the first real lead in nearly 2 decades. That single call reopened the door to a case everyone thought was long buried, and this time, Mercer wasn't letting it go. Detective Alan Mercer sat in his car outside the Nebraska State Crime Lab on a gray January morning in 2019. Engine idling, breath fogging the windshield. The call he'd received the night before had kept him awake for hours. After 17 years, he was finally walking back into a case that had never really left him. He took a deep breath, grabbed the manila folder labeled Whitaker, Rachel 2002, and stepped out into the cold inside the lab. He was greeted by forensic analyst Dr. Mia Porter, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a calm, deliberate way of speaking. She'd been part of the new generation of DNA specialists who had helped solve cases once thought impossible. Mercer followed her to a glass-walled conference room where a laptop and a stack of printed reports waited. "We reran the DNA sample from the jacket," she said, opening the file. "The new analysis gave us a clean STR profile, much clearer than what we got back in '02. Then we ran it through CODIS again. No direct hit, but it matched partially to a recent entry in the system. A man named Derek Klein, convicted of a DUI last year in Iowa. Turns out, the genetic markers line up in a way that suggests a close biological relative, maybe a parent, a sibling, or a child." Mercer leaned forward. "So someone in his family could be our suspect." "Exactly," Porter replied. "We can't pinpoint who yet, but we can build out the family tree." Mercer nodded, the gears already turning. "Get me everything you can on the Kleins." For the first time in years, he felt that old adrenaline, the sharp mix of focus and fear that came when a cold case began to thaw. Derek Klein's record showed he'd grown up in Clayridge, the same small town Rachel Whitaker had called home. That detail alone was enough to make Mercer's stomach tighten. The Kleins had lived just a few miles from the Whitakers' property back in the early 2000s. Derek's father, Charles Klein, had worked as a truck driver, known around town as a quiet man, who mostly kept to himself. Mercer spent days combing through archived police reports, background checks, and old addresses. The deeper he dug, the clearer the connections became. Charles Klein had been questioned briefly in 2002. His name appeared on a list of residents who lived along Highway 29, near where Rachel's car was found. At the time, he told deputies he'd been out of town on a long-haul job that night. No one ever followed up to confirm his alibi. Mercer flipped through the original interview notes. Faded handwriting, vague statements. Claimed to be hauling freight to Kansas City. No receipts, no log entries provided. He muttered under his breath, "How did we miss this?" He spent the next week tracking down Charles Klein's old employer, a now-defunct logistics company based in Lincoln. The few surviving records showed no trip logged under his name for that date. It was possible Klein had never left Clayridge at all. Mercer drove out to the rural address listed in the file. The old Klein property sat abandoned now, a decaying farmhouse surrounded by overgrown weeds and a rusted mailbox leaning at an angle. Snow crunched beneath Mercer's boots as he walked toward the porch. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Old newspapers littered the floor, yellowed and brittle. In the corner, a torn calendar from 2003 still hung on the wall, frozen in time. Mercer shined his flashlight across the room, and there above the doorway was a faded photograph tacked to the wood paneling. A young woman smiling. It took him a moment to realize who it was. Rachel Whitaker. The photo looked like one taken from a local newspaper, her Teacher of the Month portrait, the same one that had been printed on missing posters in 2002. Mercer's pulse quickened. Someone had taken that picture from the paper and kept it here. He snapped photos of the scene and called for a warrant. Within hours, a forensic team was combing through the property. In what used to be the basement, investigators found an old storage trunk filled with personal items, women's jewelry, scraps of fabric, and a cracked Polaroid camera. Among them was a silver charm bracelet engraved with the initials RW. Mercer recognized it immediately. Rachel's mother had mentioned it during her first interview, saying it was a birthday gift Rachel wore almost every day. The evidence was enough to reopen the case formally. Charles Klein, now 73, was living in a nursing home outside Des Moines. Mercer coordinated with Iowa authorities to arrange an interview. He found Klein sitting by a window, overlooking a gray parking lot, oxygen tube looped around his nose, a thin blanket over his knees. His eyes were clouded, but there was something sharp still hiding behind them. "Klein," Mercer began, taking a seat across from him. "You remember a girl named Rachel Whitaker?" Klein's lips twitched just barely. "Can't say I do." Mercer set a photograph on the table, Rachel smiling in front of her classroom. "You lived 4 miles from where her car was found. You told deputies you were out of town that night, but your employer's records don't back that up." Klein's gaze shifted toward the photo, then away again. "That was a long time ago. People forget things." Mercer leaned in. "Not me. I don't forget." The silence stretched long enough for the hum of the oxygen machine to fill the room. Then finally Klein spoke, his voice rough and low. "A lot of girls disappeared back then. It ain't my fault if one of them wandered off." It wasn't a confession, but Mercer knew it was close. After the interview, Klein's DNA was collected with a warrant and rushed to the lab. 3 weeks later, the results came back. It was an exact match to the unidentified sample found on Rachel's jacket and under her fingernails. Forensic confirmation after 17 years. When the call came in, Mercer sat quietly at his desk, eyes fixed on the framed photograph of Rachel from the original caseboard. He whispered to himself, "We got him, kid. We finally got him." The arrest made headlines across Nebraska. Cold case solved after 17 years. Retired trucker linked by DNA to teacher's murder. Reporters swarmed Clayridge, cameras rolling outside the sheriff's office. The small town that had long tried to forget now had to remember everything. Rachel's parents, Tom and Evelyn Whitaker, were notified personally by Mercer. They sat in silence as he explained the new evidence. Evelyn covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "All these years," she whispered. "I thought she was just gone, but he was right there. He was right there." Tom, now 72, stared out the window, jaw tight. "I saw that man at the feed store every week. He looked me in the eye. Auntie pie at the diner next to my wife. And all this time he knew. Within days, the Clayridge community was shaken to its core. People who had once worked alongside Klein, who'd trusted him to drive their children to school or fix their tractors, couldn't reconcile. the man they knew with the monster described in the arrest reports. Local news stations replayed old footage from 2002. Search parties trudging through fields, candlelight vigils, Rachel's smiling school photo. A generation that had grown up hearing her name as a whispered memory now watched justice finally begin to take form. Klein was extradited back to Nebraska to stand trial for first-degree murder and kidnapping. During his arraignment, he sat motionless, thin hands folded, eyes downcast. When asked if he had anything to say, he only muttered, "Wasn't supposed to go that far." For Mercer, it was a mix of triumph and sorrow. He had chased the truth for nearly 2 decades, but when it finally arrived, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. The evidence against Klein was overwhelming. Forensic testimony confirmed his DNA at the scene. The items found in his basement matched descriptions from missing property reports. Even the Polaroid camera was traced to a purchase he made at a Clay Ridge pawn shop in early 2002. Still, Mercer couldn't stop wondering, why Rachel? Why that night? During follow-up interviews, several women from Clay Ridge came forward with stories they had never told. One said Klein had offered her a ride home after a shift at the diner years ago. Another remembered him following her car late one night, backing off only when she pulled into a gas station. Back then, no one thought much of it. Now it painted a chilling pattern. Rachel Whitaker might not have been his first target, but she was the one who fought back. As the trial approached, Mercer often drove out to the stretch of highway where Rachel's car had been found all those years ago. The road was smoother now, the trees taller, but the wind still sounded the same, hollow and endless. He'd pull over, step out and stand there, remembering the flashing lights, the deputies combing through the brush, the sound of her mother crying out her daughter's name. He thought about how long justice had taken, how many nights her family had prayed without answers. Now, finally, they were closer than ever, but Mercer knew something about cases like this. When you dig up the past, it doesn't just reveal what happened. It exposes everything that was missed, everyone who looked the other way, and all the pain buried along with the truth. And in Clay Ridge, that truth was about to shake more than just one family. The morning after Glenn Klein's arrest, Clay Ridge woke up to a storm of disbelief. Word spread fast, faster than anyone could contain it. The man who had fixed tractors, coached Little League, and sat 2 pews from the Whitakers every Sunday was being accused of killing Rachel. By sunrise, satellite vans from Lincoln and Omaha lined Main Street. Reporters gathered outside the county courthouse, microphones ready, waiting for the official announcement. Detective Alan Mercer stood behind the podium, his eyes shadowed with the weight of 2 decades. "We have taken Glenn Klein into custody," he said. "He is being charged with first-degree murder in connection with the death of Rachel Whitaker. This arrest comes as a result of DNA evidence that links him directly to the crime scene." There was a murmur among the reporters. One shouted a question. How could he have gone unnoticed for so long? Mercer didn't flinch. "Because he was one of us," he said quietly. "And sometimes evil hides where we least expect it." At the county jail, Klein sat motionless in his orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, staring at the wall. When asked if he wanted a lawyer, he nodded. When detectives asked if he remembered Rachel Whitaker, his lips barely moved. "Everyone in town did," he said. Mercer watched him carefully during that first interrogation. Klein wasn't the nervous type. He was calm, almost too calm. The kind of man who'd had decades to convince himself he'd gotten away with something. When the DNA report was placed in front of him, confirming a match with the blood found on Rachel's jacket, Klein didn't react. His eyes flickered just once, then settled again. "You've been carrying this for 23 years, Mercer said quietly. "You know it's over now." Klein stared at the table, then said, "You don't know what you're talking about," but Mercer did. And so did the science. The investigation that followed was methodical and brutal. Every old report was re-examined, every witness recontacted. Forensic teams searched Klein's property, a 2-acre stretch of farmland outside Clayridge. In a shed behind his house, they found a box of old photos, snapshots from community picnics, county fairs, and random events dating back to the late 1990s. And in that box, slipped between pictures of tractors and barbecue gatherings, were several photos of Rachel. Some appeared to have been taken without her knowledge. That discovery shattered any lingering doubt. Detectives traced his movements from 2002. Back then, Klein had been married with a young daughter, working as a mechanic at Benson's Farm Supply. He'd lived less than 3 miles from where Rachel's car was found. When she disappeared, he'd volunteered in the search efforts, walking the same fields where her body was later discovered. He had hidden in plain sight. The revelation tore through Clayridge like wildfire. People who'd known him for decades couldn't reconcile the man they saw fixing their engines with the monster, described in court filings. His daughter, now grown, issued a brief statement saying she was devastated and heartbroken. His wife had divorced him years earlier after what she described as long-term emotional distance. She refused to comment on the arrest, but told police she always felt something dark beneath his quiet exterior. As prosecutors built their case, Mercer spent long nights reviewing the files, piecing together what had really happened that March night in 2002. They believed Rachel had stopped for gas around 10:15 p.m., then driven north toward home. Somewhere along the way, she either pulled over or was forced off the road. Klein's old pickup, a green 1987 Ford, matched a description from a witness who'd seen a truck idling on the shoulder near that stretch of road. The forensic team found microscopic traces of Rachel's blood under the rubber matting in the truck's bed, traces that had somehow survived 2 decades of use and cleaning. When confronted with this evidence, Klein asked for a break, then sat in silence for nearly 15 minutes. Finally, he whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen." Mercer leaned forward. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Glenn?" But Klein shut down again. He refused to say another word without his lawyer present. The prosecution had enough. They charged him formally, setting trial for February 2023. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Locals, reporters, and the Whitaker family, now older, wearier, but still resolute. Rachel's mother, Carol, sat in the front row clutching a silver locket with her daughter's photo inside. Her father, Tom, leaned on a cane, his once strong hands trembling. When Klein was brought in wearing a suit that hung loosely on his aging frame, the room went silent. He avoided eye contact with the family. The prosecution's opening statement was straightforward. DNA evidence, witness testimony, and photographs would prove beyond doubt that Glenn Klein had abducted and killed Rachel Whitaker. The defense argued the DNA was contaminated, that the state's handling of evidence over 20 years made it unreliable. They painted Klein as a victim of faulty science and small-town vengeance. But the jury listened closely as forensic experts testified. They explained how the 2002 sample had been preserved and later retested using next-generation sequencing, the same methods used to solve cases across the country. The match probability was 1 in 1.2 trillion. Then came the photos, the ones from Klein's shed. When projected on the courtroom screen, an audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Rachel unaware, laughing near the fairgrounds. Rachel crossing the street outside her school. Rachel at the gas station, her smile faintly visible in the reflection of the glass door. The images painted a chilling picture. Klein had been watching her for months. A retired co-worker testified that Klein often mentioned Rachel in casual conversation, saying she had a light in her, that she was too good for this place. The witness said at the time it sounded harmless, even admiring, but now in context, it was terrifying. During one recess, Mercer stood alone in the hallway outside the courtroom, staring at the photograph of Rachel that had hung on his office wall for 20 years. "We waited too long," he murmured to himself. "But we got here." The trial stretched for 2 weeks. Each day peeled back another layer of truth. When the defense tried to suggest that another man, a drifter passing through town, might have been responsible, Mercer's testimony destroyed the theory. "We tested every sample," he said firmly. "Only one man's DNA matched." Glenn Klein's. In his closing argument, the prosecutor spoke not just to the jury but to the entire town. This is not just about one night. This is about 23 years of silence, guilt, and lies. It's about a man who took a life and then dared to live among us as if nothing happened. Justice may be late, but it is not lost. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom felt frozen in time. Carol Whitaker whispered a prayer. Mercer stood in the back, hat in hand. 3 hours later, the jurors returned. The foreperson handed the verdict to the judge. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." A sob broke from the front row. Carol pressed the locket to her lips. Tom leaned against her shoulder, tears spilling down his face. Mercer exhaled deeply, the kind of breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 20 years. Klein didn't move. No reaction, no plea, no emotion. Just an empty stare as the judge read the sentence. Life without parole. Outside the courthouse, snow began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, covering the steps where reporters waited. When Mercer stepped out, he looked up at the sky and whispered,